In this video we will talk about what is state in React.js and different ways of managing state in React application. In React, state refers to a built-in object that allows components to maintain and manage dynamic data. Unlike props, which are used to pass data from parent to child components, state is localized to the component itself and can change over time based on user interactions or other factors. There are two different types of state in React.js: local state and global state. In local state, each component can have its own state, which is managed internally. This is commonly done using the useState hook in functional components. In global state, state is shared across multiple components. This can be managed using various methods, including React's Context API, Redux, or libraries like MobX. Let's talk about state management. Managing state in React is essential for building dynamic and interactive applications. There are several ways to manage state in React, including local component state, Context API, and external libraries like Redux. Let's go through these methods in detail, along with coding examples. The simplest way to manage state in React is using the local state within components. This is done using the useState hook for functional components. useState initializes the state variable, count, with a value of 0 and provides a function, setCount, to update it. Event handlers. The increment and decrement functions update the state using setCount. Let's talk about another way to manage and lifting state up. When multiple components need to share the same state, you can lift the state up to their nearest common ancestor. The parent component holds the count state, which is passed down to the child component as props. The child can modify the count by calling the setCount function. There is another concept that is essential when talking about state management in React.js. It is called Context API. For more complex applications where state needs to be shared across many components, the Context API is useful. This React code demonstrates state management using the Context API. It begins by importing essential hooks and functions from React, such as createContext, useContext, and useState. A context variable named countContext is created to facilitate sharing state across components. The counter provider component utilizes the useState hook to manage a count state variable, initializing it to 0. This component wraps its children with countContext.provider, providing the current count and the setCount function to all descendant components. The counter display functional component retrieves the current count using the useContext hook and displays it in an h1 tag element. Meanwhile, the counter controls component also accesses the context to render two buttons for incrementing and decrementing the count. The app component ties everything together by rendering counter display and counter controls within the counter provider, enabling seamless state sharing without prop drilling. This approach effectively showcases a clean and maintainable way to manage state in a React application. We can also manage state using Redux. For large applications, Redux can be an excellent solution for managing state. It provides a centralized store for state management. To do this, first you need to install React Redux package by running following command in terminal. npm install redux react redux. Now set up a store by creating a file named store.js and paste following code in it. This code defines a simple Redux store for managing a counter state. It begins by importing the createStore function from the Redux library. The initial state is set with a count property initialized to 0. A reducer function is defined, which takes the current state and an action as parameters. It uses a switch statement to determine the type of action. If the action type is increment, it returns a new state with the count incremented by 1. If the action type is decrement, it decrements the count by 1. If the action type does not match either case, it returns the current state unchanged. Finally, the createStore function is called with the reducer to create the Redux store, which is then exported for use in other parts of the application. Also paste following code in your app.js file. Inside the code, create store. Sets up a Redux store with an initial state and a reducer. Provider wraps the application to provide the Redux store to all components. useSelector accesses the state from the Redux store. useDispatch sends actions to the Redux store to update the state. The code utilizes Redux for state management, specifically to implement the counter feature. It imports essential React and Redux components, including provider, useSelector, and useDispatch, along with the Redux store. From store.js, the counter functional component accesses the current count from the Redux store using the useSelector hook and defines two buttons for incrementing and decrementing the count. When clicked, these buttons dispatch actions to the Redux store with types increment and decrement, respectively. The main app component wraps the counter component with the provider, allowing it to access the Redux store. Managing state in React can be done in various ways, depending on the complexity of your application. For simple use cases, local state with useState is sufficient. As your application grows, you may need to lift state up or use the Context API or Redux for more scalable solutions. Each method has its own use cases, so choose the one that best fits your needs. Thank you for watching. आपको वीडियो पसंद आए या नहीं? अपना फीडबैक जरूर देना and please subscribe.